Hi, thanks for listening to the monthly social here on YouTube. If you haven't already, please click the subscribe button. It would mean the world to us. All right, hope you enjoy the rest of the show. Take care. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the monthly social self help segment. I am your host, Guido Prino, and joining me today is author, psychotherapist, and speaker Phyllis Leavitt, who's going to talk to us today about America in therapy. Welcome to the show, Phyllis. Thank you for being here. How are you tonight?
I'm really great. Thank you so much for having me.
It is my pleasure. I don't know that I've had a guest from New Mexico before. So welcome New Mexico as well. Um, Phyllis, I understand that you've been in psychotherapy in the field, applying your craft in various forms, for 30 plus years.
Right.
I'm always interested in how people sort of are on the path that they are on or have been on. Can you share with us what initially attracted you to go in this direction? And how did you know? How did you know it was the right thing for you?
Yeah, I think like so many people, I ended up in a career that had personal relevance for me. I had um, yes, some significant trauma in my childhood that I had forgotten, like totally buried, and it really affected the way that I grew up and the way I felt about myself. And when I was in my mid 30s, I had three little children at that point.
Mm.
Um, it kind of came crashing down and I think this happens for a lot of people. It's like this stuff starts to bubble up from your unconscious because it really like just like your body will have symptoms because something needs to be healed. And I think our psyches are similar, that our emotional things will start to bubble up asking for healing. And at that time, I knew some people that were going to therapy, and before that, really, my exposure to psychology and psychotherapy was pretty much, you don't do that. It's kind of a sign of failure, or you shouldn't
Mm.
need it, or whatever. But some of the people that I knew had turned to going to therapy, and I really felt like I needed some help that I couldn't give myself, and I gave it a shot. And it was really life changing for me because I really at that time, and I'm a child of the I was born in the late 40s. And so when I grew up, this psychology was just not a language we spoke, and no
Mm.
one talked about your early childhood or your formative years influencing the rest of your life and how you feel about yourself and the choices you make, and the places you might feel blocked. So when that whole area opened up for me and I went to therapy, I began to understand that my childhood had a tremendous impact on what I was experiencing as an adult. And that was really life-changing because up until that point, I had felt like I was just a flawed person. Um, so lots of different puzzle pieces started to come back together, and I started reading books on psychology because I was just really interested. And I decided to go back to graduate school and get my own degree,
Mm.
and that's what I did.
It's a great story of personal connection and self-awareness. And I think I asked the question because sometimes we have educators and students that will listen in and they draw on themselves on the information for career and just the value proposition of what you put here on the table in terms of your personal connection and understanding how that passion for what you learned about yourself could translate into not just a career, but it ended up probably being a career where you're helping others. You've
Mhm.
also said something else that I thought was really interesting, and that is the how we've perceived therapy, and how that has changed over the years, and what a time for you to
Right.
watch that transition, right? Where it's
I
a word that's a little bit therapy. Now
Mhm.
it's a word that's kind of like, oh, therapy, right? Oh,
Right.
I can
Right.
I can help myself and there's tools and people out there who can help me and kind of go into. So it's I say for you, what an interesting time to watch that transition.
Right.
Um, you have on your website, phyllisleavitt.com, and I'm going to have that link in our show notes.
Great.
I was looking through and getting to know you as we were approaching the show, and you say something on the website that when you became a psychotherapist, that you never imagined you would one day be entering a political arena. I know we're going to get a little deeper into some of these pieces later, but what exactly does that mean?
Well, I think there's a couple of things that it means. One, first of all, I still consider myself an introvert. So, doing a one-on-one in my office with a client or a family or a couple or a child really suited my introvert nature because I really like either to be very internal or very deep with other people, with a small number of people. So that's the realm I really saw myself operating in. But what happened for me was that because of the work that I did with so many people and so many families, and I think many psychotherapists could tell you the same thing, that even if you're working with one individual, you're actually working with the family of origin and the influence of their family of origin, even if those people aren't in the room. Because just like I was influenced by my parents and what happened to me as a kid, most of us are, for better or for worse. And sometimes it's for good things. But to the extent that we're hurt by people that we depend on, the work really involves reworking what happened with other people
Mm.
so that we're not subject to the negative beliefs or the coping mechanisms that came out of that don't serve us. So after working with so many people, it became really clear to me that our family systems are not just our families of origin. There are communities, there are schools, there are places where we work, there are states, and there are government, and there actually, the world population is our larger and larger levels of family function that we're all conditioned by. And that we suffer from if they're not healthy, if the dynamics are dysfunctional in any of those family units, if they're inhumane, if they're discriminatory, if they're abusive, if they're neglectful. Um, we are all affected by that. So I began to see family systems mushrooming out in its influence on the largest levels of our functioning. And in the world we live in today, where we're all inundated, or most of us are inundated on a daily level with what's going on all those levels, we can't help but be affected by it. And so seeing that, I felt like a really deep need to speak out about what I was seeing happening in these larger levels of family functioning, that's hurtful to people. Because I think many, many, many people today are being seriously hurt, injured, and sometimes we know killed by these dysfunctional dynamics that are happening in these larger and larger family systems that we're all a part of. So, and some of that is politics, but I want to take it out of the realm, if I may, for just a minute, of partisanship. Partisanship is certainly part of politics today. But when I say I never saw myself in a political arena, I don't mean it from a partisan point of view. I mean that really everything today is political. Religion is political,
Yeah.
economics is political, um, business is political, social functioning is political, gender is political. They're all political issues. And so
Right.
when I say I never saw myself entering that arena, it was like, well, we're all in that arena, whether we think we are or not. And if I want to, which I do, want to talk about not just the ill family dynamics that are hurting us, but I want to talk about what do we do? How do we break that cycle? What
Mm.
are healthy family dynamics? What have I learned as a therapist that I could contribute to a healing conversation? So that's pretty much what happened for me, is that the individual work, my own individual work, and my work with individuals just became a lens through which I saw what was going on around me, and I felt like I needed to share that.
Well, you've certainly gone outside the comfort and realm of your office space, it seems, as you've, gotten into these different spaces. Um, and we're getting to know you. Part of our introduction here is always getting to know the person that we're talking to. And I'm going to go back and ask you as well. You say something else. You say that the greatest threat to our survival as a country and as a species is our declining mental health.
Yeah.
And I read that and I think to myself, that's pretty bone chilling that you would expand those thoughts at the species level. And somebody reading that might say, geez, Phyllis, that's really dark. That's pretty dark that the of an outlook. Um, what got you to that point?
Yeah, I think, and again, it's just taking that family systems lens and expanding it outward and looking through that lens. So, but I'm going to talk now. So I say the family, family like of origin, I'll call that the microcosm, our personal relationships, and our larger communities and our countries and our global community is the macrocosm. Um, so on the microcosmic level in a family, if what we see in our offices, and I'm sure that I'm not alone in this as a psychotherapist, massive dysfunction and abuse that people bring to therapy, much more than maybe the average one of us would like to know or thinks is true. But over all the years that I have been a therapist, people like you and me, people who are functioning in their lives, they're going to work, they're taking their kids to school, and they're in deep pain from sexual abuse, from physical abuse, from emotional abuse, from discrimination on the playground when they were a little kid, from addiction, and all kinds of things that really hurting us.
Mm,
And so what we see in families is when abuse and neglect is not addressed, when people don't have the opportunity to get help, they don't want help, they can't afford help, whatever the circumstances are, those symptoms escalate for many people, not for everyone, but for many people, they become more helpless because they were overpowered, or they become more addicted because they're trying to numb out their pain, or they become more
mm,
aggressive because that's the way they think they can survive the best. And they've identified with the power of the people that have hurt them because they don't want to be victimized again. And the more we see this escalating in society, we now have, you know, incredible gun violence
mm,
and mass murders in the news practically every day. I mean, when I was writing my book, and I was talking about this in my book, on my computer at that moment, there was a news flash that came up. I don't know why it came up, but of yet another mass murder. And at that point, there had been more mass murders in the United States than there were days in the year. And that was 2023. Um, and so we're talking about escalating mental ill health becoming deadly. And none of us is really safe from that. None of us knows if we're going to be the next person in the shopping mall who happens to be there when someone completely loses it. And that's just the tip of a big iceberg. But why I say that is because on a national and international level, the investment in weapons of mass destruction that we're seeing today, um, is an investment in how to kill millions of people. And were we to use the things that we now possess in terms of weaponry, we could destroy life as we know it. And so for me, we've sort of been told that these are partisan issues. One party believes in this and another
yeah,
party believes in that. But actually, the investment in that kind of defense structure, and also in the ways that we pollute the planet for gain, for
yeah,
immediate gain, these are self-destructive. These are self-destructive behaviors and self-destructive beliefs and self-destructive coping mechanisms. And if we were doing these things as an individual, if somebody was poisoning the water in their house, if they were spending all their money on guns instead of food for their children, um, or if they were killing people, we would say they were mentally ill. We would say they were disturbed, and we would say it's criminal behavior.
mm,
But somehow there's this gap between what we consider criminal and mentally ill in our own lives and what we condone and allow on larger and larger levels of society. And so If what we continue to believe in is that we have to so-called beat the bad guy
Right.
and win the war, the upshot could be a third world war in which none of us survive. And that's a mental illness issue. And we've been all taught to believe it's a partisan issue, it's an ideological issue. But I would say, from a psychological point of view, that the destructive language that's coming out of the partisan divide in America today is a sign of mental illness. People are not sitting down and working it out. They're not treating each other with respect, um, the way we would want people in our own lives to treat us.
It's interesting because I was going to ask a follow-up question that said something like, is our mental health so fragile as a nation that it actually threatens our survival? But then when you put that perspective that you just did, what you're actually saying to me, correct me if I'm wrong, is that the actual threats that we've created, mental health was part of the journey that influenced the actual creation of those threats.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. And then it perpetuates them because as long as we believe that the answer is war, then we're prone to keep acting on that. And we see that all over the world. I mean, that is what's happening now. And look at the results. Thousands upon thousands upon thousands of innocent people are dying. And it's horrific.
Phyllis, when I first saw your profile, what caught my attention was the title of your new book, America in Therapy. And admittedly, without having read it and only going on what I see on TV, whether it be the news, the TV shows, the culture, I thought, what a great title for a book. And I wondered if America knows it is in therapy or that maybe it needs therapy. Um, what is it that not only inspired the title, but then the book itself for you? And we got a glimpse of it, I think. But
Yeah.
what is it that inspired it, Phyllis?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was the original title for my book, which got reduced down to this one, which I really like better. But the original title was Out of My Office and Into the World, because it was really like I want to take what I've learned in my office
Right.
about our internal dynamics and our group dynamics, our family dynamics. I really wanted to make that common knowledge because I don't know still that even though therapy is much more accepted, I don't know that we know on a societal level that some of the principles that we operate on from the highest levels down, government and large institutions and other institutions of power, are really abuse dynamics that are hurting people. Um, and even if we know that there are abuse dynamics and they're hurting people, what happens in an individual family where there's abuse is that it's always justified. I hit her because she talked back. I beat him because he got bad grades in school.
Right.
I molested her because she wore that short skirt. Whatever it is, abusive people always justify what they've done and they put it on the victim.
Yep.
It's because the victim did this that I did that, and I had a right to do it. And we do the same thing on our larger levels. These people are lazy and entitled, therefore we have a right to withhold from them, or whatever we do. And these are actually abuse dynamics, and the effects of them do not go away. And I can tell you that without any hesitation from my own life and from the masses of people that I've worked with, that we may compensate, we may survive, we may white knuckle it through,
Yeah.
but the lasting effects of being hurt by other human beings do not go away and they show up somewhere.
Yeah, I was thinking there's a transfer of accountability. I see a lot of that transfer of accountability online in the social media circles where people become somebody outside of themselves interacting with other people and there's I don't know if excuse is the right word, but they justify their behavior based on some event or the behavior of others that they perceive to be one thing or the other. You mentioned towards the end of that something like you started to get into the personal, and I understand that you weaved your personal life into the book as well as obviously your professional life and experience. Why was it important to have that dual connection when you did that?
Well, I think for a lot of reasons. One of them is, none of us is perfect, and I think it's not my style to put myself out there as the person. I did the work, I've recovered, now I know. That's not my style, and that's also not what I think is helpful. We're in this boat of fallibility and vulnerability and making mistakes together. And we can learn together how to do it better, but I don't hold myself above anybody else. So that's one piece of it, which I think is really important. And I appreciate it when I read other people's books or other people's writing where they hold themselves as part of the picture because it levels the playing field. And that's what we need to do. We need to level the playing field here. None of us is above having hurt somebody. I may not have murdered someone, fortunately, but none of us is above having hurt someone. I've hurt people in my life just as much as I've been hurt. And and I think we need to have a new lens on that because right now we live in a very right, wrong, good and evil society, which fosters projecting our own shadow onto other people when we all have a shadow.
Yeah.
And if we could actually own that and celebrate owning it rather than feel deep shame about it, we would be coming a long way toward healing ourselves as a society. And the other reason why I felt like it was important to put myself in the book is because um, I have stories too, and I'm not a big part of the book, but I reference, what I've learned because some of what I learned about psychotherapy came from graduate school.
Mhm.
Some of it I learned from working with people, and some of it I learned from doing my own work. And why not share it all?
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah. Phyllis, a larger message I got from just what you said and thinking about it, um, understanding and tolerance and learning from each other. We're also quick to parlay our own expertise and experience, and then sometimes when you pick up a book like what you've produced, America in Therapy, and you consume it, you take some time to actually understand what somebody else put together, a point of view, other information. And you always hear authors will read other authors materials because it betters themselves, right? and
Mhm.
I said earlier, social media and our behaviors online and things that contribute to some of these things. I don't always see people doing that, and I wish that they would just, take a moment to breathe and understand and consume information, digest it, as opposed to just out, 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 maybe a little
Yeah.
bit of in, right? Um, is there a connection you're expecting people to make when it comes to the message in the book, America in Therapy? What would you think would be the main relevancy in their lives as they consume it?
Well, I think that there's probably a lot of connections that I hope people will make, and that's why I have a lot of chapters in my book. So, but one that I could start with here. So just to know that I can't say all the things I hope
Of
that people
course.
will take away, but what a big one is this that and this refers to something that I just said briefly, and I'll expound on it just a little bit, and that is we live in such a right, wrong, good guys, bad guys kind of world. And it's really an old paradigm that needs to go because I think what we've learned as psychotherapists is that inside the perpetrator is a victim.
Mm,
There are victims and there are perpetrators, but people who become massive perpetrators are hurting people. Something happened to them. They weren't born a murderer or a rapist
mm,
or somebody who stole. They weren't born that way. Something happened to them. They either saw those role models, or they were really hurt, or they were neglected, or they were ostracized, or they were abused, or something happened to them where the messages they got about themselves were painful and negative, and the ways that they figured out to cope with their lives were dysfunctional. And for many people, and certainly not all people, and we all know that there are these hero and heroine stories where
Right.
people have had horrible lives and they've somehow managed to just rise from the ashes like the phoenix. And wonderful. That's fabulous. And I love those inspiring stories. But we have to know that there's thousands of people who don't, and they become highly symptomatic. And the two main symptoms, and I talk about this a lot because I think this is really happening all over the world. It's definitely happening, and I think it's very obviously happening in America, that more and more people are becoming very passive and feel helpless because they've been so dominated, they've been so hurt, they've been so abused, they've felt so helpless, they've felt so hopeless, they don't see opportunity for themselves. They've maybe been the subject of, massive injustice, and they're easily manipulated because they've never been able to experience authentic personal power for their own behalf. So they're passive, or they're easily controlled, or they're easily dominated because that's what they've already been conditioned to be, not because they're bad people or they're failures or they're less than, but because that's where their experience of other human beings has left them. And equally, there are many, many people who have identified with the aggressor and have become highly aggressive, and they tend to attract each other. From and again, I would say probably many, many therapists can say that this is their experience. Either their clients are the more passive person and they've ended up in the relationship with somebody who's very dominating, or their parents were that role model and they suffered from that. So this thing of the more and more people becoming helpless and easily controlled, or easily identifying with the strong guy because they haven't felt any power in their own lives, and more people identifying with the aggressor, um, is, spells a very bad outcome for our society. We need people who are appropriately empowered, but have boundaries and have care for the impact that they have on one another. And when abuse and neglect go unchecked on a family level and on a societal level, we start to erode that sense of appropriate personal power with boundaries. And I'll just say one more thing and then please jump in. Part of those boundaries are a commitment to nonviolent conflict resolution.
You've given me so much. Uh, with some hesitation, and we started talking about the political arena earlier and how vast that was. But as you were saying what you were saying, and I'm watching, I'm an outsider to America, relatively speaking. I mean, in Canada, we get a lot of American cultural influences because we're just, the border's right there,
Right.
and we see the TV and we, the images and the music, and like it's all very integrated, even though we're two different countries. In that political space, we've watched some of those signs and symptoms that you've said, that you just talked about. Is that is that one of the things that's happening where people see themselves powerless and they latch on to something that looks powerful? They see themselves as voiceless, and then they latch onto something that they perceive as a voice, whether it's the right or wrong thing to do. And I, you said we got to move away from right and wrong and good and bad. I don't know how to do when it comes to those spaces though. Where do people, like, how do they distinguish and what do they do? And is that what's happening right now?
Well, I think, yes, I think that's part of what's happening right now. I think what's happening right now is so complex that you can't nail it down to one thing. But I think one more element of what you just described and what I had tried to outline is that often in abusive families, and I've seen this upfront and close, personal with clients that I've worked with, one person who might be the target of abuse in a family, because it's not always everybody. Sometimes it's one child or the spouse. Um, that often the abusive person will um, reward complicity in the abuse. I've had clients who have told me that their siblings were rewarded while they were the one who was was beaten or sexually molested. I've even had clients tell me that the abusive parent enrolled their siblings in holding them down while they were beaten.
Mm.
And then they were rewarded with more, more gifts and more freedoms. And we see that happening in our society as well, that sometimes people are really rewarded for being complicit with abusive institutions and people in positions of authority. And this is extremely dangerous.
Still, is partisan politics part of the problem?
Well, what I would say is that let me start by saying this. The beauty of psychology is that it's not partisan. The whole field of psychology is about healing relationship, healing my relationship with myself, healing my relationship with my significant other or my children or my boss or my colleagues or my friends or what it's all about healing. It's about starting from the place of conflict and divide and maybe huge upset or hurt or anger or whatever it is. And this is human. We have conflict. That's part of being people right now. That's part of just being human. We're not going to agree on everything. We have different natures. We have different backgrounds. We have different religions and genders and all the different things that we have that bring different points of view to the table. But the whole field of psychology is about bringing us together in safety, in understanding, in empathy and compassion, in learning how to listen deeply the way we want to be heard by others, in reaching compromise or agreement, in making amends for the things that we ourselves have done that are not so great, in taking responsibility for ourselves. These are some of the very important elements of the best psychotherapy today. And partisan politics, the way we're going to have probably different parties. I think it might be good in America if we had more than two, but maybe very good in America if we had more than two. But it's not the fact that we have partisan politics. It's the way our mental unwellness is influencing um, the partisanship that we
Yeah.
have. We're entitled to different opinions. What we don't have is the psychological skills and commitment to sit down and work our differences out, not only for the sake of the people in the room, having those great divides or differences of opinion or conflict, but for the sake of the family of America. And I say this for a very good reason, because I've worked with many, many people who had highly conflictual parents
Mm.
and they really suffered from the tension, from the aggression, from the verbal violence, from the threats, from whatever the lack of love and belonging and safety was in their home, even if that violence wasn't directed at them.
Phyllis,
Children,
when did this start to percolate? Because as we go through the conversation here, and I look at the foundations, and we talk about we start at the family unit, and I've heard you say in many different ways, this thing has expanded, and the different systems have grown, and some of the abuse and some of the things that we've gone through that have impacted mental health have now um, eroded into these other arenas.
right?
When did this start? And is it fixable?
I probably don't know when it started. I mean, a lot of people say that the roots of these kind of great divides were being really grown and fostered many years ago, and they're sort of coming to public attention and fruition today. I don't know exactly when it started, and I think that there's a lot of contributing factors. But I think one of many, many things, so don't take this as a total answer, is,
Mhm.
it's we also live in a very much of a society, and I think it's human nature. It's not just America, where we have a great investment in having more of whatever it is we want. And more means more wealth, more
Yeah.
power, more sex, more influence, and sometimes it's more righteousness. And it's very possible to have more and more of those things today.
Mm.
And And so we see people who are really addicted to power and they don't want to let go and they are not willing or able to see the impact of what they're doing by wielding so much uncontrolled power on masses of people, just like an abuser in their own home or a
Right.
dysfunctional person in their own home can't see and doesn't want to see the impact they're having from what they're addicted to in terms of their own power and control.
Is that, and look at, I don't, I'm not the expert here, is there some element of sociopathy in what you just said?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And, there was I don't know if you ever heard of Barbara Marks Hubbard, but she died a couple of years ago, but she was both very spiritual and kind of into, personal development, and she also had been involved in politics. And I heard her speak one time, and she had been in Washington, and I think at one point she had even either been on the vice presidential ticket or was a candidate for being a vice presidential candidate. And anyway, she had really been in Washington and been immersed in the whole political scene there. And she said something very profound and also probably pretty obvious. She said that her experience was that human beings just simply cannot manage the level of power that they try to have. We just psychologically are not able to manage it. We need to share power with one another. We need to have lots of people at the table. And that's exactly what good psychotherapy does. It brings everybody to the table and helps people listen with respect, with understanding, with empathy, and with a format that's safe enough that it fosters the desire to repair the relationship. And we desperately need that in our country. We need that. We need people to sit down and listen to each other. And even if we disagree, be committed to working it out.
So we've given each other some examples, and we've talked about, in some ways, how it has become increasingly clear that we've got divisiveness, we've got hatred, there's violence that is escalating. Again, as someone observing, I've watched it sort of escalate and erode in the United States over the past few years. I've now watched it, through the pandemic years. Also, it's starting to happen in Canada,
Mm,
and I see people opposing each other in ways that I'd never seen before. And you touched on it a few times as we've been talking about from a psychology perspective, but helping us understand, how does psychology help us understand what is going on? But more importantly, because I think you've kind of touched on that, what do we do with that information? So I'm going to read your book and I'm going to get this information. What do I go and do with this information that will help change divisiveness and hatred and violence?
Well, I think the easiest answer and the most accessible answer is to apply what we've learned in our own lives. We can all use an upgrade. And I speak for myself. I'm married to a wonderful man, and we can still trigger each other. Okay. We still have our little arguments over who said what and how we're going to manage, cook the fish or whatever it is, right? Because we're
Yeah,
because we're fallible human beings, because
sure.
we, you know, I like to share, that like part of his wounding as a child was to really be dominated and hurt, and part of my wounding as a child was to feel invisible and unheard. And those
Mm.
two wounds fit together you know? So he wants his voice and I want mine, and it can erupt over the littlest thing. But, we have you're laughing. Tell me why you're laughing.
Well, because like, our culture, like those things, being Italian, and we've watched them. I've watched those things happen, but they were all, we all knew we were coming back from it, right? Like, I watched my grandparents have those little tiffs, but I knew they were coming back from it. And
Right,
and my parents and even ourselves growing up, right? And it's, the cooking thing made me laugh, because we should cook it this way. No, we should cook it that way. No,
right,
I want to do it this way. And then, you look at each other and you kind of laugh, but there's always there's something underlying that we've had in these relationships, that we can come back from it, that
right.
we don't get to that eroded, escalated next step.
And that's the perfect point, because that's what I was going to say is we have that container. We know we're going to come back from it, and we might bumble our way around for a little bit, but we know we're going to come back to love and connection. And one of us will always go first if the other one's, holding back. And we do, and it builds trust, and we can count on that. But I have to say that many people don't have that in their relationships.
Mm,
There's a very high divorce rate among people
yeah.
who have no skills, no tools, and no way to come back from what appear to be very small arguments, because the underlying issues are deep wounds that have not been healed. And so that's what brings a lot of people to therapy. That's what brings a lot of couples to therapy, is that they might have been fighting about how to cook the fish, but they were really fighting about, very deep unmet needs in their childhood. And so the whole point of good psychology and good psychotherapy is to help us heal those wounds now so we don't pass them on.
Let's talk about for a moment what we know and what we don't know. As a psychotherapist, I feel like you can go around and you can observe and you can analyze and you can draw your conclusions. I often do those things at the micro expression level in different situations to see if there's an opportunity to adjust in how I approach someone in conversation. You just did it to me. The micro expression, before I smiled big, you saw me smile small and you picked up on it, right? But look, I'm not a trained professional. I mostly do it on experience of, through the years, I've learned this and I see how people turn their body and do this and do that, right?
Right. Totally.
Um, what have you learned as a psychotherapist that you believe, and we just talked about what people know and what they don't know, that the average citizen doesn't know, and why should they know it, and how do we get them to know it?
Okay, so you have to forgive me, because like 10 things will come to my mind when you ask a question, and I won't remember any of them except maybe two. But the
That's okay.
first thing I want to say is that, and I don't know if the average person knows this, even though it might seem like the obvious, and that is that what I've learned as a psychotherapist from my own experience, but years of working with other people, is the best food for human beings is love and belonging. We're wired for love and belonging when we come into this world. It's part of our survival to be loved and to belong. Otherwise, we don't make it as infants. And along with love and belonging, I mean, I can add other qualities like being valued,
Yeah.
being, cooperation, peaceful conflict resolution, celebration of diversity. There's lots of elements that go along with that, but love and belonging and all of the attending qualities that go along with it, that's the best food for human beings. And when we're fed that, we don't become violent and hateful. We just don't.
Hmm.
And I think we still are operating under the myth that there are just bad people out there. And it's just not true. There are people who have been treated terribly or have had no boundaries. Something has gone awry in the way that they were handled by other people or by their communities,
Mm,
and have become dysfunctional and sometimes highly aggressive and dangerous. And so if love and I would say that the lack of love and belonging and all the things I just mentioned, and again, nobody has that perfectly in their home. We don't, because we're all, imperfect human beings. But to the extent that we don't get love and belonging and safety and cooperation and celebration of our uniqueness and those kinds of things, we become symptomatic.
mm,
And the best healing is in finding safe people who help us restore ourselves to the things that we didn't get. That's the best healing. Jail is not healing. Jail doesn't cure anybody. There may be people that we simply do not know how to help, that are too dangerous to be allowed to be in society. But
yeah.
there are many, many, many people incarcerated today who could be helped, who could be restored to their essential, loving, peaceful, contributing selves if they were given half a chance and they had an opportunity to heal the hurt that had happened to them. And we just need this massive restructuring of our whole lens on who we consider bad people. And I said it earlier, and I'll just repeat it again. So if there's something I really want people to take away, is that inside the perpetrator is a victim somewhere.
Mm.
And if we could devote masses of our resources to healing people, we wouldn't need the kind of jails that we have now. And people wouldn't be profiting off of the kind of jails that we have now, which is, an issue in and of
Mhm.
itself, which keeps this whole system going. Why rehabilitate people if you can make money off of them? Sigh.
No,
Uh,
it's, you're talking truth, and you gave us a slice of the pie, and sometimes when you look at the larger pie, that applies in so many different parts of our society, right? Like,
right.
you presented right and wrong and good and bad, and the jail, and then you could start to get into the, I mean, if you look at as an example, you mentioned divorce earlier, right? And you get into parental alienation, and you get into parental rights, and there's an entire system there. And boy, Phyllis, like, love and belonging, there's a forgiveness element to all of this, as
Uh,
well. Like,
Absolutely,
you know,
absolutely. And when people have a chance to heal, when they really have a chance to heal, when they have a chance to be
mm,
heard, when their deepest pain has a place where it safely can be released and reprocessed. And I'll present some of the really good elements of the best psychology and best psychotherapy here, which is when people are hurt, they don't get any help. They become symptomatic. Underneath their symptoms, whether it's becoming aggressive or they hide or they become people pleasers or they become addicts or they become highly anxious or obsessive or driven or whatever they do to manage the pain of being hurt, inside that whole structure is some negative belief they've taken on about themselves. I'm not lovable. I'm not worthy. I'm stupid. I'm fat. I'm ugly. I'm not deserving. I have to meet everybody else's needs before I can take care of myself. Whatever it is, we are taught, we get messages, whether they're overt or covert, of something that we take on that is a negative belief about ourselves, and
mm,
it fuels negative coping mechanisms. And but none of us are those negative things. We just learned that we were. There's no baby that was born stupid or bad or undeserving or
yeah.
unlovable, but we've learned those things. And so we have to take that whole structure apart. And how do we take it apart? The very best access to taking that apart is being with people who don't see us that way, people who actually see us as an essential human being, no matter what has happened to us or no matter what we've done. And this is a very hard thing for many people to absorb. If somebody has murdered somebody, it's very hard to see them as not a murderer.
Hmm.
There's this beautiful man named Brian, I think his name is Brian Stevenson. I hope I'm saying the right name, who works in the prison system. I think his job or what he does, I believe he's an attorney, and I believe he helps people who were falsely incarcerated, for who really were innocent. But one of the things he said that I always quote is, and he says this to people, and he believes this from having worked with so many people and seen into their essence. He says, no one is the worst thing they've ever done. And I would add to that, no one is the worst thing that's ever happened to them. And this is really the whole point. And I'll just say it, and then please jump back in. Um, that is that until we realize as a society that there is a victim inside a perpetrator, and we're committed to the very best of our ability, which will not be
Yeah.
perfect, to healing the victim inside the perpetrator, we cannot break the cycle of violence that we're in.
You're I'm not disputing it. You're asking a lot of people in terms of who they are today to do something like that. I'm not saying it's not doable. I'm just looking at the enormity of it, that people will look at that and say, how would I ever do that? Um, there's a couple of universal things that you did. Like, to me, they're universal. Love and belonging is universal. It's not just in America. It's
Right? It's
overseas. It's
human.
in Canada. It's human. Love and belonging is universal. Um, and you took us on a journey because you talked about the family systems earlier. And you've broken down those family systems in a way that helps us understand how we could work towards healing hatred, violence, and injustice. We just finished saying those things, right? But some people would say that those family systems come down to two things: having and not having. And when you don't have, that fuels hatred and violence. Um, how do we apply these things? How do we come back from that to make a difference in those cases? Where do you find, like, where do you find it within yourself to make that change? What is your incentive to make that change?
Well, I'll go back to the individual and the individual family, because the universal thing that brings people to therapy to get help, which
Yeah,
is ultimately to make changes, is pain. That's the number one reason why people come to therapy. They're in pain. Something in their life is not working. Just like if you have a horrible
yeah,
pain in your abdomen, you're going to finally go to the doctor because your appendix might be bursting. You might put it off hoping it'll go away, but when it gets bad enough, you'll go, right?
mm,
And it's the same with our mental and emotional well-being. When we're in enough pain, there's a motivation. Not for This is not true for everyone. Some people will hold on tightly to their old coping mechanisms that aren't working. But when it works, pain is a great motivator for actually making change. And you probably know people in your life, and I do, people who were alcoholics and they were destroying their marriages and they were on the brink of divorce. And it was like, either stop drinking or you're not going to have your family. And if there's enough pain at the thought of losing their family, there's a motivation to make a dramatic change that they might not have thought they could do. And so, on some level, I think we have to feel our collective pain, which is
mm,
massive, which is, people. It's not just in other countries where there's war. There's horrible injustice going on in the United States. There's whole segments of our population who can't earn a living wage,
yeah,
who are, much more likely to be thrown into prison for the color of their skin or get longer sentences because of the color of their skin. There's people who are being targeted now for their sexual orientation, for their, for so many reasons that are being justified
right.
in the dysfunctional family of America. And there's enormous pain. And we also have a very collective, and this is part of the problem. It's individual and it's societal, that we have so many ways to numb it out. And the pain is trying to break through. And it is in many areas. I mean, we
Yeah.
see it all over the news if we could interpret it that way. Let me tell you something from the family systems model that really I think is desperately needing to be understood by the collective. So when I first started as a psychotherapist, I worked primarily with children. That's what I thought I wanted to do as my career. And as it turned out, I would say 95% of the children, if not more, that were referred to me for therapy were suffering from a conflictual divorce. There was actually nothing wrong with these children, but they were wetting the bed, or they were being aggressive to their siblings, or they were failing in school, or they were talking baby talk when they were 6 years old, or they had nightmares, or they had night terrors, or they
Mm,
had fear of strangers. They had some kind of symptomology that was so glaring that their parents brought them to therapy.
mm,
They had no idea that wetting the bed was not a problem in itself. It was a sign of the anxiety that the child was suffering
yeah.
and didn't know how to manage. And unconsciously, they became symptomatic as a way to call for help for their family.
Mm,
And once we could identify what was really troubling them, and if you are familiar with play therapy, or anyone out there is
Yes.
familiar with child's play,
Yeah.
inevitably their themes are going to come out in their play. And then I could reflect their themes back to their parents and talk about, um, you need to express your upset and your anger at each other away from your child. You need to try to work out the custody without the child feeling like they're a pawn on the chessboard. Whatever it was. And many parents, and again, they're doing their best to survive the pain of the divorce, but many parents unconsciously will try to turn their child against the other parent, and children can't tolerate that. And we're doing the same things in our countries and in our larger institutions, where people in power are highly conflictual and the general populace is suffering, and they're becoming symptomatic. And so what we say in the whole field of psychology is that child who was wetting the bed or beating up on their
Yeah.
siblings, we say that they're the identified patient. There's nothing wrong with them, but they're showing the symptom of the family dysfunction.
Yeah.
And if we were to begin to look at the most symptomatic people in our society and what we say is they're calling for help for the family. And they are. They're calling for help for the family. And in the best circumstances, the family gets help. And in the worst circumstances, nobody gets help and they become more symptomatic. And that's
I
what we see.
I, I worry when I hear you say some of those things because I think that you've opened the book on what is actually going on in our society, and that those behaviors, and you talk about pain being the motivator, and along with that motivator, um, on the flip side of it, you you must have some healing principles,
Oh,
right?
absolutely. Yeah.
And you talk about, when it comes to the best psychotherapy that's missing from present day policy that helps with some of those conflict resolution strategies. As we're talking about what people are doing in society, what they're doing to each other, um, you gave some great examples, um, in terms of the family unit and how that extends into what's going on in all the different arenas in society. What is missing from that policy that would help us with the conflict resolution, Phyllis?
Well, again, I think that there's many things, but I will zero in on something that I do go into detail in my book, because I think it's something that we can all work with in our own lives. And like I said, where does it start? It starts with us. The more aware we are of healthy human dynamics, the more we're able to embody them. And again, I really want to repeat, none of us does it perfectly. I don't do it perfectly. I don't know anybody who does. But if I have something to come back to, and this goes to what you were saying about, you're in a container that's basically safe. You're going to work it out. If you're
Hmm.
in a container that's basically safe, then you've already developed some kind of skill to make it that safe. And the single biggest healing element in that regard is taking personal responsibility instead of blame.
Right.
What can I do that can make a difference in this conflict? And so I'll break it down into some very digestible parts. And I think it's nothing new. It's just that we don't think this way because we're so invested. Most of us are so invested in being right. I'm right and you're wrong, and I'm going to show
Mm.
you how wrong you are,
Right.
and I'm not going to stop until you agree.
Right.
Right?
Yeah. I will not hear anything that you say
Right.
because I'm right.
Right.
Yeah.
And the problem is the other person feels exactly the same way.
Right.
So you're just in conflict and it escalates or it divides you and you hate each other or you feel completely mistreated and misperceived and, all the things that we can feel when we don't have any way to actually listen. So when I say, and I really think this is the hardest thing for human beings,
Yeah.
honestly, I think it's the hardest thing for human beings to take full responsibility for themselves. And that means if I'm angry at you, and I may feel, and I may be very justified in being angry at you, or very justified that I was hurt by you, or that you blah blah, whatever it is that I
Right.
my issue is with you. Um, it's still my responsibility to restrain myself in terms of the way I react. Do I scream at you? Do I roll my eyes? Do I slam the door and walk out of the room? Do I call you names? Or, do I subtly put you down or overtly put you down? Do I bring up every single bad thing you ever did, for the last 30 years? I can be responsible for restraining my most impulsive and dysfunctional reactions to
Mhm.
you. If we did that by itself, and that's just step number one, but if we did that by ourselves, we wouldn't have war. We wouldn't. We wouldn't have the kind of police brutality that we have. We wouldn't have so many things, because the bottom line underneath everything I'm about to say is that what really heals is if I treat you the way I want to be treated.
Right.
Period.
I-
Period.
Is that the gap, the healing gap between love and politics?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That we allow and condone and perpetrate on other people things that we would consider criminal if they happen to us.
Do you see our ability to make this happen anytime soon?
So, I like to think, I like to think that anything is possible. I believe that there is hope. And like I said, when someone is in enough pain, if collectively we could actually feel our collective pain, I think anything is possible. And so part of why I wrote my book is to try to open that door to actually feeling the impact of the pain that we're now perpetrating on each other, but not for the purpose of blaming anybody.
Mm.
The purpose of, okay, our appendix is bursting as a society. Are we going to have surgery? Or are we going to let it burst? And so that's how I see it. I think there's always hope, but I think we need tools and we need skills and we need a new understanding of what actually heals.
So interestingly, and I'll share with you, myself as I do these shows, and I've got multiple shows online, and I
Mhm.
engage online, and people will engage with me. You put yourself out there, right? You put yourself out there, you present different topics and opinions, and not everybody always agrees with you. And
Right.
not everybody is always nice to me, right?
Right.
They will attack me in different ways. I had one instance where I think one gentleman started, there's something wrong with your hair, and how could you come on camera with your hair that way? And I read these things and I
Right.
laugh. I have two choices there. I'm going to either come back at this person with something or ignore them, or maybe something else. And I tried the something else, which is, hey, thanks for your comment. I hope that everything's okay. Um, you know, happy to hear your opinion on the topic. And that went on. So then I got another response, and the person still attacked. And I still thanked them, right? Because now I'm in experiment mode, because I want to see, is there any way I can get this individual to stop the attack, focus on what we're actually talking about, and in any kind of way show kindness or acknowledgement of any kind. With that particular one, it was up to about the fifth message of me just being kind. All I did was reciprocate kindness, right? Hey, it's okay. I understand you're angry about what we're talking about here. I appreciate that you're angry and that you're coming across. Have you thought of this? And thank you for sharing your anger. And you know, they stopped. They couldn't take it anymore. They saw that I wasn't going to bite on the anger, and uh, they're like, this person, it doesn't matter what I say to them, it doesn't matter what I call Guido. I'm how he's not going to get angry at me. He's not giving me the anger back, right?
Right.
I've had others where they stop and they go, "Oh wait, you're not attacking me back. You're listening to me. You're going to absorb what I'm saying and maybe even consider it, right?" And so these two little pockets. So as I see what you're presenting here, And as I look at some of those things that I've done, I have a little bit of hope that you've come up with a
Exactly.
formula that we can apply, and,
Exactly.
and we have some examples, Phyllis.
So you just gave a beautiful example of being what I said. The bottom line is that we focus on our own personal
Yeah,
responsibility. And that's what you did. You took responsibility for your response. You could have grabbed the bait, you
yeah,
could have yelled, you could have insulted the person, you could have put them down, you could have done anything, but that's not what you were committed to. And so your commitment was to being open, being, you still had a boundary. You didn't
did. Yeah,
have the bait, but you were understanding and you were peaceful. And that's what you put out into the space, and eventually it worked. So what everything that I'm talking about is about that. And so I'll just outline. The first element was restraint of our, and that's what you did. You restrained your worst impulses.
yeah,
If you had them, maybe you didn't have them,
yeah,
but and the second one is that we sort of reflect on ourselves. Well, who am I being here? Maybe my tone, and this doesn't apply to your example because you
yeah,
you did beautifully,
yeah,
but in a conflictual situation with somebody who's you're intimate with, who you can easily get triggered by, let's say, the second step is like reflecting on yourself, taking a deep breath, like, who am I being here? Am I being kind of aggressive? Am I being intolerant? Am I rolling my eyes, or, doing something with my body posture or my tone of voice that actually is off-putting, or, is in some way a put down of you or dismissive of you? So I reflect on what I'm doing that might be contributing to the conflict. It doesn't mean I'm responsible for what you did, but I'm not focused on that. Just like you weren't focused on what the other person was doing, you were focused on you and who you wanted to be. So self-reflection goes right along with the next thing, which I've already said, which is I take responsibility for me.
yeah,
So if I really didn't speak to you in a nice tone of voice, can I make amends for that? Can I say, I am upset with you, but I'm sorry I talked to you in that tone of voice? Because I don't want you to talk to me in that tone of
right.
voice, right?
Yeah,
So the fourth element is really like making some kind of amends if it's appropriate. And if it's not appropriate, if you have a stand that you feel really just needs to be said, like, I don't want you to talk to me the way you did, I can still be responsible for how I communicate that to you. Do I scream it at you? Do I tell you you're a jerk? Or do I tell you that's not acceptable to me? That's okay. We can do that. And the fifth element is that I'm committed to finding some kind of reconciliation with you, some kind of agreement, some kind of way forward. Because the commitment is that we're going to somehow reconnect as best we can,
right.
and so what can I agree to? What would you be willing to agree to, rather than stomping out or slamming the door, or, and even if I have to take a time out because I'm really upset with you, I can take a time out and say, I'll come back and talk to you later when I have calmed down, not when you have calmed down. You know what I mean? And then the last one is whatever we can do to reconnect. Whatever I can do to reconnect with you. I was a witness to an altercation between two people I really love recently.
Mm,
And at one point, one of them just reached out and put their hand on the other person's back in a very loving way. And it shifted the entire conversation.
right,
After that, they worked it out beautifully. So, that person took responsibility in a way that was just a loving gesture. It's so easy to take responsibility if that's what our mindset is. And I like to imagine, like in the highest reaches of government, and, because so much of that is witnessed now in social media, how people
mhm,
talk to each other and what they say, and they walk out and they say all these deprecating things or whatever they do. What if they were role modeling that, of like, who am I being in this conversation? How could I change the conversation just by the way I talk to you, which is what you did.
right.
And one of the things I say is one person can change the whole dynamic. They can.
It's been a goal of mine, Phyllis, as I do this show. It's become sort of a goal to say, look, we don't have to agree, but can we start at being respectful, and can we start at being truthful, right? And I
Right.
always say there's a difference between being truthful and being honest, because we all have our own version of honesty depending on where we want to go. But
Right.
being factual and being truthful and being respectful, I've been trying to promote those as building blocks. Now, I feel the things that you just told us, I feel like you went into the toolbox and you just gave us a whole bunch of tools of what we could reach in and try and use for ourselves. Um, and so deep into this part of the conversation, don't get mad at me for asking,
I
what has
won't get mad at you for anything.
what has prevented people from using those tools? And you've given us different answers, but if you summarize it in a way that I know you probably can, what has prevented people from using those tools that if they did, we would have different outcomes?
Yeah. And just know that everything I say in answer to any of your questions is only a partial answer because there's so many different ways to approach all the things that you said. So please don't take anything I say as like, this is, the word of God and this is all you need to do.
No, we want to apply situational awareness, right, Phyllis?
Right.
That's what
For
it is.
sure.
Yeah.
For sure. And just know that there's lots of things to be said about each thing. But your question is, why don't we apply these things?
What's prevented people from applying these things? And if we could tell them that, and you kind of have, but if you could summarize telling them that, maybe they will. Maybe they'll have that self-reflection moment where they go, I remember this show with Phyllis, and I need to reach into my toolbox, right? And what can I do?
Yeah, so hopefully I can remember a few
Yeah.
things here because there are a few things that come up for me
Yeah.
when you ask that. One of them is that I do think that most of us grew up believing that there's just right and wrong, and we're just supposed to stand our ground and fight for what's right. And even to the death, kind of the death of the relationship or the whatever. And it's just a really bad role model for human relations. There's nothing wrong with standing up for what you believe in, but one of the things that I've learned so deeply as a psychotherapist is, and I'm not the first person to say this, I'm reiterating something that I learned, and that is that you can be right or you can have a relationship.
Mm.
And just having to be right can be relationship killing, because both people think that they're right. And so one of the things that I've learned this in my marriage, and I've learned this as a psychotherapist, that yes, I do want to stand up for myself when I think that's appropriate, and there's things that really need to be addressed. Um, and the commitment to reconnecting, the commitment to hearing each other eventually, if not right away, the commitment to reconciling and actually recommitting to our love for one another is a much better experience than just walking away right. And I think we need to have that experience and embody it to know that sometimes it's just really better to let go.
Mm.
And again, I'm not talking about letting go of something that feels abusive or
Yeah.
that, but really like, okay, is it, I've been writing about this stuff ad infinitum and talking about it, and my husband and I were having just a difference of opinion about how to handle something. And I thought to myself about what I've been saying. And I thought, reflect on yourself, Phyllis, reflect on yourself. And the minute I did that, I thought, you know what? I don't even have to be attached to this. He wants to buy one thing. I want to buy another one. I said to him, well, why don't we do it your way? And if it really doesn't work for me, would you be willing to reconsider? And of course, he was like, yes, you know?
Right.
And sometimes it's not that easy,
Yeah.
but sometimes it really is.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I think really gets in the way is I'm right and you're wrong. And we've grown up on that model and it's deeply ingrained in us. Um, but another thing that I think is that I think we don't have the right model for admitting that maybe we're off kilter. Like, so people sometimes get really stuck in a position, even when they know that they should be listening to their partner or that there is another point of view. But it's like our pride gets in the way because we have to win the argument, or I don't want to admit that I, maybe I was actually really wrong about what I said. And I'm telling you, it's hard to do. Like, like, that and it seems silly in hindsight,
Yeah,
but just look at the other person and say, "You know what? I really did kinda screw up, or I really
yeah,
did talk to you in a not nice way, and I'm sorry." It's like and so we sort of associate shame with that instead of celebrating it. "Wow, I could be accountable for myself, and you could, and we could
yeah,
celebrate that in
accountability.
our relationship."
Yeah,
Instead of, like,
accountability.
walk away with your tail between your legs kind of thing, because like, "Oh my god, I did a horrible thing." Um, so I think those are some of the reasons I think people, but I also think one of them we talked about earlier, which is people get really invested in having power and control, and they don't wanna let it go.
Yeah. And it's just, I think it we get into a value system of what that power is and what it means and why I need it. And then we go back to the roots that you've brought up in
Right.
terms of our, like we talked about pain and some of the things that are rooted in perhaps our experiences. Phyllis, you say that your book America in Therapy offers hope. Does it?
Yeah, because I'll say it very simply. Did a really long healing journey myself, and I would just say, and I'll probably be on that healing journey for the rest of my life. I don't think we arrive, I think it's a process. Um, but I'm not living in the dark night of the soul the way I was in my 30s. And it's because I was able to reach out for help, and I got help, and I was able to release some of that pain of my childhood, and I was able to learn some of these skills and do things differently, and by trial and error, and over time accept my own humanity, which means I'm not going to do it perfectly, and it's okay. And believe me, that one's still challenging. I still I still have a model of perfection I try to hold myself to. Um,
Uh,
yeah, that's a big one. Um, and so if there's hope for me,
yeah,
and I've seen so many people do incredible healing work on abuse that you can't even imagine. Like, I mean, I've heard stories from people that seem like they would be in the movies of something that you wouldn't really believe happens to people. People have suffered really horrible abuse and neglect
yeah.
and witnessed violence, and been the subject of violence, and come through it because they've felt loved and they've felt safe and they had a container to release that pain and release some of the negative beliefs they took on about themselves and learn new coping mechanisms and experiment with them and recreate their lives. And if there's hope for individuals, then there's hope for us as a country, because our country is individuals. That's
Yeah.
what it is.
Yeah. Phyllis, I hope that anybody who's listened to our segment here would want to pick up your book based on everything that you've told, because we've got toolboxes and we've got a wealth of knowledge, and it seems applicable in so many of the different facets of our lives. Um, Depending on where you've seen yourself in our conversation today, and it could be way over here where it's something very big and very serious, or it could be way over here where it's something very simple like online conflict and conversation and just day-to-day things. But you've certainly run the gamut for us. Where is the best place for our listeners to pick up your book, America in Therapy?
Oh, thank you so much for asking. Yeah, it's available from all the major booksellers. You can buy it on Amazon and Barnes and Noble and any other online bookstore, book services. It's available. So, and you can also order it directly right off of my website, which is www.phyllisleavitt.com.
Wonderful. And we'll splash that on the notes as well. I have consumed way more of your time than I think I planned when and people know, like I usually say, I have a set of questions I'm going to ask the guest.
Right.
I probably have gone off and veered off into so many other different things. So thank you for your patience as I've done that. And I'm so thankful for that. Is there anything else that you would like to leave us with before I do let you go, Phyllis?
Yeah. Well, I just really want to thank you. And you didn't take up too much of my time. I love sharing about this. I want to reach as many people as possible because I feel like people are hungry for a different way to look at what's going on in the world. And I think people are especially hungry to feel that there's something they can do. And what I would say is anything you can do to heal yourself is a contribution to everyone. And any little act of kindness, patience, tolerance, celebrating someone else's differences, just being open to a new idea, saying thank you, acknowledging somebody for a little service they perform, telling somebody they look good in blue. Whatever we do that really lifts each other up instead of pushing each other down is a service to all of us. And I think, I'll just end with this, that that one of the big takeaways for me of working on my book America in Therapy and being a therapist and working with family systems was that the part and the whole are inextricably related. So who we are as parts of this human puzzle influences the whole, and the healthier the whole, the happier and safer and healthier we are. And so we each have a part we can play, and everybody's part counts.
Giving us a sense of love and belonging is Phyllis Leavitt, author, psychotherapist, and speaker, who has shared with us her professional and personal insights through her recent book, America in Therapy. You can find out more about Phyllis and how to get her new book, as well as other helpful resources, at phyllisleavitt.com. I will have her contact information in the show notes. Again, thank you, Phyllis, so much for doing this, and take care.
Thank you.